The first of the integrated steps in external respiration was pulmonary ventilation, which I said was the physical movement of air into and out of the respiratory tract. A single breath, or respiratory cycle, consists of an inhalation, which is an inspiration, and an exhalation, which is an expiration. The respiratory rate is the number of breaths per minute. In normal adults, at rest, this can be 12 to 18 breaths per minute. Breathing maintains an adequate alveolar ventilation, or the movement of air into and out of the alveoli. And this prevents the buildup of carbon dioxide and ensures a continuous supply of oxygen to keep pace with absorption by the bloodstream. In the cardiovascular unit, I introduced you to the concept of a pressure gradient. Blood flowed out of the high pressure arterioles into the lower pressure interstitial fluids. And similarly, air also moves down a pressure gradient from high pressure to low pressure. In a closed, flexible container, like the lungs, inside a thoracic cavity, the pressure in the air can be changed by increasing or decreasing the container's volume. Therefore, expansion or contraction of the thoracic cavity directly affects the volume of the lungs, and thus the pressure on the air in the lungs. So changes in the volumes of the thoracic cavity result from movements of the diaphragm and the rib cage. The diaphragm forms the floor of the thoracic cavity. A relaxed diaphragm is dome-shaped, pushing up into the thorax, compressing the lungs. Contraction of the diaphragm flattens and pulls it down, expanding the lungs. The rib cage, you can see the elevation expands the thorax and relaxation depresses it. Inhaling, the external intercostal muscles are going to elevate the rib cage and the diaphragm will contract. So these things together will increase in the volume of the thoracic cavity, and the pressure on the inside of that cavity will decrease. Since the inside pressure is lower than the pressure outside, the air will move into the thoracic cavity. Now, during forceful exhaling, the internal intercostal muscles lower the rib cage. During passive exhaling, relaxation of external intercostals lowers the rib cage. So a decrease in volume means a pressure increase. So in this case, the pressure on the inside of the thorax is higher than the pressure outside, so air will be forced out. At the end of the exhalation and end inhalation, the pressure inside and the pressure outside are the same. They're equivalent. So as I alluded to, the respiratory muscles are used in various combinations depending on the volume of air that must be moved into and out of the system. These respiratory movements are classified as quiet or forced breathing. Quiet breathing is going to use the muscles of inspiration, so the diaphragm and the external intercostals, and the exhalation will be passive, so it's just a relaxation of those external intercostals and a relaxation of the diaphragm. That exhalation will occur. But in forced breathing, like when you're exercising, you're going to be using your primary and accessory muscles for inhalation. So your external intercostals and your diaphragm, and you're going to be using your internal intercostals and abdominals for your exhalation. So you're actually going to be using muscle contraction to exhale, to force the air out. And that's one of the reasons that when you're exercising, you can get that side cramp from those muscles that you normally don't use unless you are performing forced breathing. So based on your mode of breathing, you'll be employing different lung volumes and capacities. This graph displays all of the differences. You can see the amount of air moved in and out of the lungs during quiet breathing is called tidal volume. Tidal volume, and that's that kind of light blue strip just right in the middle. Now, dipping downward, expiratory reserve volume, which is the kind of pink strip in this graph is the amount of air voluntarily pushed out forcefully at the end of a tidal volume exhale. So if you breathe in and exhale normal, breathe in and exhale normal, and then squeeze your lungs, the rest of the air that comes out is your expiratory reserve volume. And on the flip side, your inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that can be taken in above a normal tidal inhalation. So if you're doing just regular quiet breathing in and out, in and out, in, and then in again, that is that big purple strip on the top. That is your inspiratory reserve volume. Now adding up the tidal volume and the inspiratory and expiratory reserve volumes gives you the vital capacity, or the maximum amount of air moved in and out of the lungs in one cycle. The vital capacity is not the total lung capacity, however. There's always a bit of residual volume, and you can see that's kind of that light green and darker green strip on the very bottom. That's the amount of air remaining in the lungs even after your maximum exhalation. And so that brings us to a checkpoint. Go ahead and pause the recording before you move on. We've learned that the gas exchange with the external environment occurs between the blood and alveolar air across the respiratory membrane. This process depends on the partial pressures of the gases involved and the diffusion of molecules between gas and liquid. So there's going to be a partial pressure gradient that is present that we're going to be working with. So atmospheric air that we breathe is made up of 78.6% nitrogen, 20.9% oxygen, and 0.04% carbon dioxide. The remaining percentage is water vapor. Now at sea level, atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, and each gas in a mixture contributes a proportional pressure, or a partial pressure. Therefore, if you were to add the pressures of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and the water vapor, they would all total 760 millimeters of mercury. And we can calculate the partial pressures of any gases then, using that same formula. And so I've calculated the partial pressure of oxygen on this slide, where the oxygen is exerting 20.9% of the pressure of the total pressure. So you take 20.9% times 70 millimeters of mercury, and you get a partial pressure of oxygen at 159 millimeters of mercury. Now the reason that partial pressures are important is because it determines the rate of diffusion between the alveolar air and the bloodstream. Now keep in mind that the partial pressure of oxygen that we just calculated is for atmospheric air, but air that enters your respiratory tract changes as it mixes with moisture and residual volume air. Therefore, the partial pressure of oxygen in alveolar air is actually more like 100 millimeters of mercury, or about 13.2%. Now, low oxygen blood, with usually a partial pressure of about 40 millimeters of mercury, leaves the right ventricle of the heart through the pulmonary trunk and comes to the lungs. Now, oxygen is going to diffuse from the high concentration to low concentration. Diffusion is diffusion. So from alveolar air, where the partial pressure is 100 millimeters of mercury, to the blood, which only had 40 millimeters of mercury, until isotonic conditions are achieved. And likewise, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the high concentration to low, so from the pulmonary arterial blood, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is about 45 millimeters of mercury, to alveolar air, where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is more like 40 millimeters of mercury. And again, until isotonic conditions are achieved. And that's what this figure is trying to show. You have the low oxygen blood, which is pictured blue here, coming in at 40 millimeters of mercury, and that is going to be absorbing oxygen from the alveolar, or the respiratory membrane, where the partial pressure of oxygen is higher, and 100 millimeters of mercury. You can see as the blood turns red and is leaving that alveolus that it now has the same partial pressure as the alveolar oxygen at 100 millimeters of mercury. And the reverse is happening for the carbon dioxide. That blue blood coming in has a carbon dioxide partial pressure of about 45 millimeters of mercury, which is higher than the alveolar partial pressure carbon dioxide, which has only 40 millimeters of mercury. And so carbon dioxide will be leaving the blood, entering the alveolar air until isotonic conditions are reached and the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide in the blood, which is now red, is 40 millimeters of mercury. So likewise, blood racing through the systemic circuit will deliver its oxygen via diffusion. And high oxygen blood has a partial pressure on the arterial side of a capillary compared to the interstitial fluid. So oxygen will move down its concentration gradient out of the blood until isotonic conditions are achieved. And again, the same but opposite is happening with carbon dioxide. So let's look at the last half of that figure. Here your high oxygen blood has a partial pressure of about 95 millimeters of mercury compared with the interstitial fluid, which partial pressure is 40 millimeters of mercury. So oxygen will leave the blood and diffuse from its high concentration to its low concentration, from blood to interstitial fluid, until it reaches an isotonic condition of a partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury. And at the same time, the opposite's happening with carbon dioxide. You can see there's a low concentration of carbon dioxide in the red blood at 40 millimeters of mercury, whereas in the interstitial fluids, it's at 45. It's much higher. So carbon dioxide moves from high concentration interstitial fluids to low concentration in the systemic capillary, now on the venule end, where the blood is turning blue. And so that brings us to another checkpoint in this recording. So we know from previous chapters that the hemoglobin in red blood cells loosely binds to oxygen. Okay? And that is the main mode of oxygen transport in the body. However, a small amount can be transported in solution in the plasma. About 1.5% of all oxygen moves this way. So when we say that the hemoglobin loosely binds oxygen, what we mean is that it's an easily reversible reaction. The amount of oxygen bound or released by hemoglobin depends primarily on the partial pressure of the oxygen in its surroundings. So the lower the oxygen content of a tissue, the more oxygen will be released by hemoglobin molecules passing through those local capillaries. The amount of oxygen released from hemoglobin is also influenced by pH and increased temperature. So active tissues generate heat and acids that lower the pH of interstitial fluids, and both the increased heat and lower pH can trigger the hemoglobin to more easily give up its bound oxygen. So recall that carbon dioxide is a product of internal respiration, also known as aerobic cell metabolism. And after entering the bloodstream, a carbon dioxide molecule may dissolve in the plasma, it can bind to hemoglobin, or it can be converted to carbonic acid. And all three of these options are reversible. So this figure is showing the three ways that carbon dioxide is transported. Again, about 1.7% of carbon dioxide is simply dissolved in the plasma. 2.23% is in red blood cells bound to hemoglobin. And remember, that's bound to the globin portion of the hemoglobin. And it forms a carb-amino hemoglobin molecule. 3.7% of the carbon dioxide is enzymatically converted to carbonic acid, and this reaction occurs in the red blood cells, which dissociates into a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion. So bicarbonate ions then enter the bloodstream in exchange for a chlorine ion, and this is called a chloride shift when this occurs. And again, remember these reactions are rapid and they're completely reversed in the pulmonary capillaries. So in summary, you can see oxygen at high concentration in the alveolar airspace will dissolve across the respiratory membrane and into the pulmonary capillary, where it is then bound, picked up in the red blood cell, or simply remains dissolved in the plasma. And when it is picked up by a red blood cell, it's bound to a hemoglobin molecule, and that hemoglobin molecule and oxygen bond is very reversible. So when that blood cell enters a systemic capillary, as pictured here, the oxygen will be released from the hemoglobin and will enter the peripheral tissues where the concentration of oxygen is low. And this can happen also with the oxygen that's simply diffused in the plasma as well. At the same time, carbon dioxide, which has a high concentration in peripheral tissues, will be absorbed in the systemic capillary, and it can either remain in solution in the plasma or it'll be picked up by a hemoglobin, forming that carb amino hemoglobin molecule, which is then converted into the carbonic acid and bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions, which is then released into the plasma in exchange for chlorine. So you can see the chloride shift happening there. And then when that red blood cell and when that plasma reaches the pulmonary capillaries, the carbon dioxide will move from its high concentration in the plasma and in the red blood cell to the low concentration in the alveolar space. And so we can start all over from there. We just keep going around in circles. Under normal conditions, the rate of absorption of oxygen from interstitial fluids and generation of carbon dioxide is matched by the rates of delivery and removal at the capillaries and lungs. If these rates become unbalanced, the cardiovascular and respiratory systems must be adjusted. So homeostasis is controlled by the brain's respiratory centers and under local control. So if a peripheral tissue, like a muscle, becomes active, it burns up its ATP and kicks on its aerobic metabolism, using up any available oxygen, and thus the partial pressure of oxygen in that tissue drops. So oxygen diffuses from the high concentration to low concentration, so the tissue cells will absorb oxygen from the interstitial fluid. At the same time, the tissue will be generating carbon dioxide, which will also diffuse from high concentration to low concentration. So carbon dioxide will leave the tissue cells and enter the interstitial fluids. At the same diffusion differences then occur between the interstitial fluid and the blood. To meet these demands, the smooth muscles in the walls of the arterioles in the area will relax and increase blood flow. Likewise, blood flow is increased to alveolar capillaries, whose pulmonary lobes have the highest partial pressure of oxygen, and it'll be decreased to the alveolar capillaries, whose pulmonary lobules have the lowest partial pressure of oxygen. And by relaxation or constriction of the precapillary sphincters, this is achieved. And that's based on the sudden drop of partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. The smooth muscles in the walls of the bronchioles are sensitive to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So when the levels of carbon dioxide in the bronchiole air spikes, it causes the smooth muscles to relax and increases the diameter of the bronchiole. So this will increase the amount of air in each ventilation, and vice versa. Neural respiratory control has both involuntary and voluntary components. The voluntary control of respiration reflects activities in the cerebral cortex, and that affects the output of the respiratory centers or of motor neurons that control skeletal respiratory muscles. The brain's involuntary respiratory centers are 3 pairs of nuclei in the reticular formation of the pons and medulla oblongata. The respiratory rhythmicity centers of the medulla oblongata set the pace for respiration, and they can be subdivided into a dorsal respiratory group, which contains the inspiratory center, and a ventral respiratory group, which contains an expiratory center. And their output is adjusted by 2 pairs of nuclei making up the respiratory centers of the pons in response to sensory stimuli, emotional states, or speech patterns. So this figure is trying to show those different groups. The dorsal respiratory group of the medulla oblongata contains neurons that control the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. So they'll stimulate the inspiratory muscles for 2 seconds, and then they're quiet for 3 seconds. And during the silent 3 seconds, the passive exhalation is going to occur. The ventral respiratory group of the medulla oblongata functions only during forced breathing. So when it activates, the accessory muscles are involved in inhalation and exhalation. So respiratory activities are strongly influenced by reflexes that are triggered by sensory information from the mechanoreceptors or chemical stimuli. Mechanoreceptors respond to changes in lung volume or changes in arterial blood pressure. For example, in forced breathing, the inflation reflex prevents overinflation of the lungs. Afferent fibers of the vagus nerve inhibit the dorsal reflex group as lungs reach a maximum expansion, and at the same time they stimulate the ventral respiratory group to start exhalation. The deflation reflex senses the end of exhalation and inhibits the ventral respiratory group and stimulates the dorsal respiratory group to start inhalations. Chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies respond to changes in pH, partial pressures of carbon dioxide, and partial pressures of oxygen of the blood. So receptors in the medulla oblongata respond to pH and partial pressures of carbon dioxide of the cerebral spinal fluid. And I have to tell you, the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide has the strongest and most immediate effect. Chemoreceptors respond to pH, especially during exercise, when an increase in the carbonic acid and lactic acid increases in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and decreases in pH are prime stimulators of respiratory rate increases. Higher centers influence respiration through their effects on the respiratory centers of the pons and by direct control of the respiratory muscles. For example, respiratory muscles can be voluntarily suppressed or exaggerated during talking or singing. The depth and the rate of respiration are involuntarily directed by the limbic system, and following activation of centers involved with rage or eating or sexual arousal. The respiratory systems of fetus and a newborn differ in several important ways from adults. So before delivery, pulmonary arterial resistance is high because the pulmonary vessels are collapsed. The rib cage is compressed, and the lungs' conducting passageways contain small amounts of amniotic fluid and no air. At birth, the newborn takes the first breath through a very powerful contraction of the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. The air inflates the entire bronchial tree and most of the alveoli. It also pulls blood into the pulmonary circulation. Cartilages and connective tissue keep the conducting passageways open, and the surfactant covering the alveolar surfaces is going to prevent the collapse of the alveolar surfaces. And so that brings us to the last checkpoint of this recording and chapter 15.